The year is 1789, and America is still recovering from the War of Independence. Although the fighting has been victorious and the country has emerged from British rule, it is not doing well. The territory is fragmented, and the states are heavily indebted. But that is about to change. On the 11th of September, President George Washington will appoint a certain Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. An immigrant only 34 years old who, despite adversity, has risen from abject poverty to the top. And although many doubt whether the young, headstrong man is really the right man for one of the most important positions in the government, Washington trusts Hamilton implicitly, and all of America will soon be able to judge whether he's justified. Alexander Hamilton was born on January 11, 1755 on the Caribbean island of Nevis. His father soon left the family and his mother died of yellow fever when he was 13. He lived with his cousin for a while, but he soon committed suicide. Alexander then found work as a clerk in a local business firm. He quickly learned the rates of exchange, negotiated daily with ship captains, and at only 16 was such a skilled manager that the owner of the company was not afraid to hand over its management to him during his 6-month absence. But at the end of August 1770, an event occurred that turned Alexander's life upside down. The island was crippled by a hurricane. When the devastating event triggered strong emotions in the 17-year-old, which he described in detail in one of his letters, which was also reprinted in the local newspaper. People were struck by the quality of Hamilton's writing and immediately realized the potential that lay within him. So they organized a fundraiser, and in just 2 months, Alexander leaves the destroyed city and heads for the American mainland. His goal is clear: to get a good education and earn respect and fame. Alexander began his studies at King's College, New York in 1773. This is at a time when revolutionary views are becoming increasingly vocal in the American colonies. The territory belongs to Britain, led by King George III. The government keeps imposing new taxes on the colonies, and the Americans don't even have any representation in the London Parliament. Thus, even Alexander is captivated by the idea of changing the situation. Despite being an immigrant himself, he writes pamphlets against British rule, and when it later comes to armed struggle, puts together a student military unit which, among other things, manages to steal the British garrison's cannons. Events come to a head on the 4th of July when America declares independence. King's College closes because of the escalating fighting, and Hamilton devotes himself fully to the war. He is convinced that it is on the battlefield that he can show heroism and earn respect. But then comes an offer he won't refuse. The renowned General George Washington chooses the 21-year-old young man as his aide-de-camp. From that moment on, Alexander writes all the important speeches for him, and the same goes for the general's correspondence. Most of Washington's writings from that time thus come from Hamilton's pen. For some, such a career would have been the success of a lifetime. But for the ambitious Alexander, it's just a stepping stone. We are now in 1780. Alexander married Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of a very wealthy American politician. Although he continues to serve Washington after his marriage, he increasingly feels like a mere clerk. In the end, he resigns his post, and it is only when he threatens to leave the army altogether that he finally gets what he wanted: a command post in an infantry battalion. In September-October 1781, he and his men were able to take part in the Battle of Yorktown, which would prove to be one of the last great engagements of the War of Independence. In the final phase, Hamilton's soldiers seize one of the key fortifications during a night operation known as Redoubt No. 10, leaving the British no choice but to surrender. America is victorious, and Hamilton returns from Virginia to New York to be with his wife and firstborn son Philip. But it takes 2 more years before the Treaty of Paris is signed, in which Britain officially recognizes American independence. During that time, Hamilton manages to get his law license, but his passion is politics. Young America is disunited, in debt, and no one really knows how to move forward. There is still a Confederate Congress formed during the war, and Hamilton serves as one of the representatives of New York State, but it is a weak and fractious institution. So in May 1787, Hamilton arrives in Philadelphia to join nearly 60 other delegates from across America. So, after 4 months of painstaking debate, the 4-page Constitution that would change the shape of the United States of America once and for all is finally written. But not all member states agree with the proposal. The centralization of state power is said to be against the spirit of the American Revolution, and many feel that the proposed structure bears an uncomfortable resemblance to monarchist Britain. Hamilton therefore decides to resolve the crisis the way he knows best, with a pen in his hand. Together with politicians John Jay and James Madison, he embarks on writing essays that became known as the Federalist Papers. Over the next 7 months, 85 articles defending the Constitution appear in the newspapers. Jay produces 5 of them, Madison 29. The other 51 will be written by Hamilton himself. As a result, on June 1788, the Constitution of the United States is ratified. The United States enters a new era, led by President George Washington and Vice President John Adamson. Alexander Hamilton is put in charge of the Treasury, and the State Department falls to Thomas Jefferson. However, there has been tension between the two ministers from the very beginning. While Hamilton favors a state built on strong industry and commerce, Jefferson would rather see America as an agriculturally oriented country. So great are the differences that two political parties slowly begin to crystallize: the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the so-called Jeffersonian Republicans. However, Alexander's list of enemies is not limited to Jefferson and his closest associates. Perhaps even more intolerable to him is the Republican Aaron Burr, a lawyer and the Attorney General of New York, who has now also gained seats in the Senate at the expense of Philip Schuyler, Alexander's father-in-law. Hamilton and Burr have been very uncharitable about each other, hoping to break the other's vase in a political scandal. Closest to this is probably Alexander, and that was at the end of 1792. It turns out he's been having an affair with this Maria Reynolds for about a year. The position, however, is not so much about Hamilton's philandering as it is about the fact that Hamilton gradually paid her husband quite a sum of money over the course of that year. Hamilton fortunately has letters hidden away that safely prove that it was not embezzlement of state funds but ordinary blackmail. If he hadn't paid Reynolds, he would have taken his affair with the woman public. That explanation will suffice for the congressmen, and they agree that it is not necessary to publicly sensationalize the scandal. The name Maria Reynolds will still come to light. At the end of 1793, a sad event strikes Hamilton's family. Elizabeth suffers a miscarriage in his absence, and he decides to resign from his position as Secretary of the Treasury. He leaves behind a considerable amount of work. For example, he was instrumental in the creation of the first Bank of the United States, or in ensuring that the war debts of individual states would be financed from the federal treasury. He also helped restore vibrant trade relations with Britain and introduced a system of tariffs and financial levies. For example, an excise tax on whiskey significantly increased the revenue of the state budget. From January 1790, Hamilton is again a lawyer and devotes himself to his 8 children. Even so, he is involved in public life, advising members of the government or writing speeches for the president. But 2 years pass like water and America is gearing up for a new election. As Washington retires, it is clear that the country is about to change. The next 4 years will now be led by John Adams of Hamilton's Federalist Party. However, under the then Constitution, the vice president is a Republican, Jefferson, and the Federalists are weakened considerably. Nor do the events of that summer give them much pleasure. 5 years of Hamilton's dealings with Reynolds are leaked to the newspapers. Alexander decides to resolve the matter in an incredible way. He publishes a 100-page pamphlet explaining in detail that it was infidelity and not corruption. He creates what is probably the first major sexual affair in American history, but believes he has cleared his name once and for all. However, this is an illusion, and rival Republicans wash their hands of it. They couldn't possibly think of a better way to embarrass a former Secretary of State and potential presidential candidate. In the years that followed, Hamilton continued to act like a loose cannon. And then when George Washington dies in December 1799, he loses his biggest supporter. This is soon evident when he clashes with President Adams. The latter claims Hamilton as an ally of the British, a claim Alexander strongly objects to in one of his pamphlets. The quarrels between the two Federalists resulted in a further weakening of their party and the victory of Thomas Jefferson in the presidential election of 1801. To top it all off, Hamilton's archenemy Aaron Burr becomes vice president. But even that isn't supposed to be the worst event of the year for Alexander. The real blow is the death of his 19-year-old son Philip. He's killed in a fight. Before the duel, he was considering whether to attend, but his father convinced him it was a matter of honor. Philip's death will forever haunt Hamilton, and he will never recover from the loss of his beloved eldest son. Even now, however, fickle fate was not finished with Hamilton. For 3 years later, he himself is challenged to a duel by Aaron Burr due to constant arguments and insults. The duel between America's first Treasury Secretary and a sitting vice president is something quite unique, especially since they both lived in New York, where duels were against the law. Either way, it's clear that after effectively sending his own son into the duel, Hamilton couldn't refuse Burr's challenge. On July 1874 at dawn, Alexander Hamilton swam across the Hudson River into New Jersey. Exactly what happened in the duel is still unclear. According to some accounts, Alexander made the decision before the duel to throw away his chance and not fire. It may have been a compromise to get his honor, but at the same time not to act against his moral convictions. In the end, he does fire, but his shot hits a branch above Burr's head. For if it was intentional, historians argue to this day. One thing is certain, Vice President Burr aimed very precisely. His shot struck Hamilton in the abdomen. He spent 31 long hours in agony before finally, back in New York, surrounded by his family, Alexander Hamilton takes his last breath. Thus died a man who, in just 49 years of his life, had done more for the United States than most of his successors. A man who, through his own grit, intellect and energy, had managed to dig himself out of a devastating situation to the very top and accomplish the almost unthinkable in his 5 years as Secretary of the Treasury. But most importantly, he had a profound influence on the creation of the United States as we know it today. A centralized country with a unified military and a strong federal currency, the U.S. dollar. And so it makes perfect sense that the $10 bill still bears his portrait. The face of the man who helped a weak bankrolling country take its first steps towards becoming a world superpower